Hello and welcome to another release video for Arterra Wines. This is going to be vintage 2021 Reds, and right now it is the end of August in the year 2023. Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode. Really excited that we have such great support from folks like you that are excited about what we do to listen to what there is to say. I'm actually really excited this one. I think there's quite a lot of interesting things to talk about in this video, and I'll try my best to keep it brief and hit the points as well as possible. So to start with, we're going to be releasing right here at the beginning of September 7 wines, and they're a little bit, you can see right behind me, a little shadowy in the dark right there. But they are split up. We have 5 that we're gonna talk about, and then 2 that we're gonna talk about separately, and that'll make a little bit more sense once I get into it. I'm going to introduce the vintage year and characteristics, how I made these initial assessments, and aging characteristics and cellaring, and then talk a bit about the wines themselves. So the vintage year 2021 for us overall was really good. It was a warmer year, and most of the grapes that we're growing here are grown and selected because they have an affinity for the warmer climate that we have here in Virginia. And it was, for the most part, quite dry for us also. The estate vineyard especially so. This was really interesting. It's very site specific. I think everybody everywhere had a different year in 2021. And I think that's pretty common across Virginia, that sites that aren't even that far apart can have totally different conditions. But we had a strong advantage coming from our geographic positioning. So if you know where we are, and I don't know how this shows up on the camera, but we're on the east side of a mountain that goes from the southwest to the northeast. So what that means is a couple things. We've got a macro effect, and we've got somewhat of like a local effect. The local effect first is if we are on the side of this slope, there's technically a gap in the mountain just above us right there in what's called Paris, where Route 50 goes across. And there's another gap in the mountain down along 66 where Markham is. And the standard kind of trend in the summertime for us is that these storms will come and ride up along the ridge and go through the gap, or they will push down through the other gap, and they tend to buffer us on this east slope of the Blue Ridge Mountain. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes we get in the track in terms of meteorology, which I don't understand. But this year and most years, we actually are kind of a rain shadow type of site. The second major macro level is what happens with the tropical systems that come through in the late summer and the ripening season. And it really, again, just depends on jet streams and movement patterns and all of that. But there tends to be patterns established within a given season. This one worked really favorable for us. There was a couple different kinds of systems that came through. And again, if you look at this kind of southwest to northeast directionality, a lot of the southern landing storms were literally pushed and kept on this west side and pushed west based on the Appalachian Mountains, Blue Ridge, and some others as you get out towards Shenandoah Valley. But it kind of held everything that landed south and kept it away from us. Whereas storms that landed a little bit north, the mountain also seemed to kind of hold them off this way. So right up here on the side slope of the mountain, we didn't really get those storms either. So we had a really dry season and a really warm season. Overall, it comes together really quite nicely. What this is going to produce in basic concept is wines that are much more bold, intense, focused, concentration. We find generally that in warmer and drier seasons, we're going to find more intensity. And in the cooler and wetter seasons, we get more vivid fruit flavor. And you tend to get one or the other. I really do love the seasons that are kind of neutral in terms of being a normal or average year, because you get the best of both. This one is going to lean more towards the intensity side, bigger wines, boldness. I think really good aging wines, they're overall going to do really quite well. So that's the main concept, is we were dry and we were warm produces intensity. In terms of how those characteristics are going to show up overall in the wines, in their youthfulness, we will find that there is some heat, maybe there is some edginess to them, and those are factors that are going to integrate over the course of time. So we usually find that as the wines grow and evolve in the bottle, you get more of this creamier, textured characteristic. This is a win-win across seasons, because in years that are cooler and brighter, like 2020, that brightness integrated to this softer creaminess. Whereas in a bold, intense season, that like intense edge is going to soften to a creaminess over the course of time. So they get really pleasant as they go. It is definitely worth saying that in keeping with our wines, that when they come out right at the beginning of September, they're just barely at this presentational point. These ones are actually really good right now, but we will see always a notable difference from September 1st to October 1st. If you can try them a couple times over the course of that month, or 1 month to the next, you see the difference. Our customers have routinely acknowledged and affirmed that. Then they really hit a next significant maturity come about January 1st. And then if they get their first full kind of calendar year cycle till next fall, that's when they're absolutely showing amazing, great things, and they've really put it all together and gotten past those youthful moments that they've had. This is also somewhat reflected in terms of how they're being perceived when they're younger here and at release. So a week or so ago, when I was at home, took home a set of these wines to make notes on it, wanted to try it and come back to it and take a little bit of time. And it was a really fascinating experience, because it was early afternoon when I opened them all and had a quick sip of each one, and they were all really nice. And I didn't really dive into it, but they were pleasant, they were nice, they were fresh. And then came back to those wines probably about an hour later and took out my notebook and started scribbling notes, and how much more had come out, and the characteristics was quite significant in that period of time. And then it was later on, another hour or so after that, when I went through them with Sandy a third time, and there was even more change at that. And these short-term changes from oxygen exposure, decanting, or just slow sipping in your glass, those are reflective of the type of things that you will see come out with bottle aging. So there's an interesting parallel there. So when they're younger, if you do have a chance, give them some air, let them breathe. And when you're in the tasting room, you have to understand that, you might be one of the first pours out of a bottle, or you might be one of the last pours out of a bottle, and that's a totally different oxygen experience. Either way, with the pour sizes we try to offer, if you can kind of go through them and let them sit and then go back through them, you really can actually see in short periods of time pretty significant evolutions in the wines. In terms of how long these wines would be cellaring, just to answer that question, and then we'll walk through the wines. I think they're still going to stick to what I have generally been recommending to people, which is they are at their best 1 to 3 years after the point in time that we release them. We release them when they're right about 2 years old. So this translates to an ideal drinking window from 3 to 5 years from the vintage date. This is a point where you have gained so much on the positive developmental side, and it's before you risk anything kind of going a direction that isn't necessarily what you personally prefer. Once these wines continue to age, one person's going to love it all the more, and another person's going to love it less. That's how wine aging is. Things change. For the most part, for the good. Sometimes you never know. The way that we produce wine is a very natural product. It's not made to be any certain way. But I do find that the wines are very ripe when they're picked. So they are much more pleasant to drink younger. And I think that kind of shifts this whole drinking window up compared to some other wines that are intolerable when they're very young. And quite honestly, I don't know why you would make wine that way. But the one exception to this aging parameter of 3 to 5 years from vintage date that's printed on the bottle is going to be Tannat. I have seen Tannat just go and go and go and go and go and do nothing but get better. So that's the one grape that we work with that is, in my opinion, truly a long haul opportunity aging if you're so interested. The rest of them, you should be kind of working through things over the course of time. So if you do the math backwards, really right now, 2018s are showing exceptionally well. And we did the Tannat vertical not too long ago. And I tell you, I was absolutely astounded what that 2018 Tannat was showing. Like, I haven't had any of the other 18s for a little while. But if you have 17 and earlier, I would recommend going ahead and working your way through those and get caught back up. So I think that's the basic concept to the vintage. In terms of how I personally go through and assess wines, in case you're interested, if not, I'm telling you anyway. I actually like to go through a set of wines like this, which usually you're going to get 5, or you pick different 5. But when I'm going through these wines, I usually say things that are different than what everyone else tells you, so this is one of those examples. I don't like to palate cleanse when I'm working through this because I find if I take water, crackers, and I reset the palate, what I'm basically finding is the unpleasant and astringent factors have more opportunity to show because your palate has gone out of whack from where it should be in relation to the wines. And the wines are ordered and organized in a way in general, or there's like a reset point conceptually, that they really do build and develop, and how one comes off of the next is very intentionally organized. So when I go through these wines, I'm not water and I'm not crackers and I'm not snacks and any of that. So I would have a good water and a good snacks and all that before, and then right after, and then as you're hanging out and having your glass or your bottle or whatever you're going to do. And when I do take a sample, I tend to assess with more volume in the palate and move it fully around the palate, all aspects of it, full saturation. You're going to get the most experience of what that wine is really like. That's for when you're going wine to wine to wine to wine, because you need to have that full saturation of palate from that individual wine. Completely different when you're sitting down with your glass or your bottle for the evening and your one wine, because then that one wine will in and of itself immerse the palate properly. But when you're going from one to the next, the best thing you can do, in my opinion, is a larger volume moved completely throughout the palate. All right, so I'm going to try to go a little faster now because my little clock's ticking up in the corner of the screen that I keep looking at and looking around, and I'm already at 12 minutes, so you're probably losing attention and wondering about the wines. Thank you for hanging in there. Again, what we're going to do is we're going to go through 5 and then 2. So starting with the 5. So you can't really see them here, and I don't know that I'm going to bring them all up to the camera. Or Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, Tannat, Petit Syrah, and Crooked Run. These are what I'm referring to and presenting as the core of Arterra. So the original concept was red grapes that perform consistently in our climate in terms of our moisture and temperature regime, both soil moisture, canopy moisture, temperatures. So wines that can produce consistent quality and character based on the grape, not based on the cellar craft, because they are all our standard operating practices of native yeast, no additives, adjustments, balancings, modifications, no bleed offs, no new oak, no nothing. You taste the grape as it is in its true state and character that originated from the vineyard. So that's why I really focus on this core. Now, we're bringing in some other things and trying some things, but these have been with us for a while and doing really impressive things. We're going to start with kind of this classic trio, which is Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, and Tannat. And then we have a little bit of a discussion point where we're going to break right there. But specifically, Cabernet Franc first really represents the year quite well, that it is a warmer climate Cabernet Franc. So this is not Loire, cool climate Cabernet Franc. This is not your classic Bordeaux, which is a cooler climate than Virginia. If you're coming out of Bordeaux, transitioning into what's called Southwest France, which is what climatically matches up with us, you're going to get a warmer climate version of Cabernet Franc. That's what this is really producing. So it's a little bit more intensely concentrated. You do get just that little bit of note of heat to it. subtly on the more structured side, if you want to say that for Cabernet Franc, but it's not quite the fruit bomb, and it's not the raspberry aspect that we sometimes find in other vintages. I would put this more onto like black cherries in terms of like the characteristic that's going to come into it. And I really don't like stating flavor characteristics because we're all different. But it is that darker. It's definitely not green and herbaceous, but it does have a little bit of that herbal note to it, which is different than green and herbaceous, but is to me very classic to Franc. Little spice note to it, really good. As far as I can tell, everybody's going to really appreciate this one. And then we're going to go right into Petit Verdot. It's going to be second wine that's offered. This is Big Petit Verdot. It's really round. It has really interesting balance to it. A lot of times the Petit Verdots are super big up front, super mellow in the back. This one actually fills out a decent bit more than I would expect. You get a little bit of spice that comes through late. This fruit was hung really late, and I've been hanging Petit Verdot until the fruit is literally falling off the vines, and that's the cue to go in and pick it, because at that point, what other cues are going to be? So very ripe, brings in a little note of kind of like a rustic, old worldy aromatic, but it's really interesting and pleasant. So again, less fruit bomb, more refined, more intense, maybe that little bit of heat to it. That heat will also again integrate over time as these age. Stylistically, this is very reminiscent of our climate matchup to Southwest France, that you get that kind of rigidity to it and intensity to it, kind of like a raw intensity, which is really interesting. But I love it. I always love Petit Verdot, one of my favorites. This then takes us into Tannat, which again has very fruit expressive characteristics. I think this is one of the best Tannats that we've produced. What I love about this vintage, and you're going to see it, especially in Tannat, it's in Petit Verdot and the other wines, is that this has all the intensity and bigness that those of us who loved 2019 loved, whereas it does not have that super high alcohol. So these are more like 13.5% alcohol, give or take, depending on the wine. But the Tannat definitely comes through with a lot of berry blast to it. But what's really interesting is this one, when it's first opened and when it's younger, it has that little freshness and berry to it. But as it breathes and opens, it brings out this, again, kind of like Southwest French aspect to it, but it also has a very reminiscent feature that reminds me of when I was in the Catalonia region in Spain. There's this cedar note that, if I remember right, was often referred to in Catalonia as a balsamic note, but not like a balsamic vinegar note. But I distinctly associate it with cedar wood characteristic, not like barrel-y, but cedary. It's really interesting how that one comes out in that wine. Another thing that I picked up on it was, I had to look it up to find out, anise is the flavor or herb or flower, I don't know the words, that are associated with the Sambuca beverage. I get a little bit of that in it. So there's some really interesting characteristics going on in here. I'm sure over the course of time, this is going to develop the vanilla notes with longer aging that we find in Tannat. But this was a great vintage. And I will note, as an aside, that as much as I do not believe in competitions, because competition wines are made for an impressive first sip right out of the bottle, and then the doctoring tends to do damage to them as they sit on a table and breathe. My wines are the opposite. The first sip is less impressive, and as they breathe, they become very impressive. So I usually don't send them anywhere because they're not made for competitions, but I like to support one organization, the Atlantic Seaboard Wine Association. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. And they do a competition every year that is specific to East Coast wines, and they do their best to sort out really good East Coast wines, which there's so many good East Coast wines. And then they engage a lot of writers from across the country, and they take them across the country, and they really work towards exposure for East Coast wine. So I really appreciate what these people do. And it is something that I'm willing to send it to. And the good news is this 2021 Tannat won gold medal and best in class, which is really funny because best in class is other red varietals. So it was against who knows what, but it got gold in it and it did good. So yay for that, right? Yeah, okay. So that was a good time. All right, now, by now you have probably noticed that something changed from the way that you know it before, which is the Petite Syrah, which I've got sitting here in spot number 4, was typically down here in spot number 2. This, I gotta give full credit to my staff that this was brought up to me when I presented it to them in the original ordering with it in slot number 2. And I think my brain was just stuck with it being there and the way things have been. And when this was brought up, it was became evident that they did a good job and pointed out something quite accurately. So the conversation, I'll give credit, started with Lauren and was affirmed with Jeff and Kelly. And then I think right on board with this whole flow of things is Mandy and Kelsey, and that's the whole team. So you'll see them all along. And we have Kendall coming for the fall. So if you've not seen her, she's super great. But the team was right on board, and they actually helped me sort something out with this one, which was awesome. Because my ordering has typically been based on palate weight. So concentration, density, fullness, volume, texture, all of that. And to some extent, I do still feel that the Tannat is the biggest, fullest bodied, weighted, textured, concentrated, dense wine, but it's very smooth. And the ripeness has tannic presence that will actually come out more as the Tannat ages, but it's a little softer right now. Whereas the Petite Syrah has always been the most tannic of the grapes and wines that I'm producing. Just inherently is. It has I describe it as a fine tannin, and that's really hard to explain what that means, but it's very pronounced and it's very grippy. And it's been interesting to see these Petite Syrah wines change over time as the vines age. The first pick back in 2017, it was very medium weight, very rustic, very light, and it was very pleasant, but it didn't make a lot of sense in terms of Petite Syrah other than potentially the impact of the East Coast moisture on it, and wanted to crop heavy and this, that, and the other. And I wasn't sure that the experiment was going to be a success. And then 18 was a little more concentrated, intense. 19 was a big wine, and that was a really dry year, so everything dehydrated, including the Petite Syrah, which is actually kind of rare. So 20 was a cooler year, a little earlier picking. It lightened back up a little bit, but still was, in terms of the pattern, if you were to put the dots and make a line through them, as a statistician would do. It was on this trajectory of gaining intensity over the years. So 20 compared to 17 and 18, we're still upward. So 21 was a really good year, and this just produced another big wine. So it is so, I don't know what other words to use, intensely structured and finishes with this grippy tannin. And what was concluded by the staff was that presence of that tannin, when you then had the Tannat come after it, it kind of threw off the palate and how you could perceive all the vivid, fruity, flavor, smooth characteristics of the Tannat. And as much as Tannat's a big wine, it wasn't perceiving right when it came second. So I went with the team, go team, and we switched this around. Now, I'm not going to say it's going to stay this way. I don't know. It's this way right now. The wines are going to age, and we reevaluate as things go, because the wines do grow over time. Body weight, flavors, characters, tannins tend to come out more. So the Tannat's going to get bigger. There's some chance that the Petite Syrah is going to get smoother, and maybe this will flip at some point. maybe it won't. So we're just going to keep an eye on that. But it's a big wine and it's impressive, and it always comes in a little lower alcohol than some of the other ones. So I find that pleasant, but it's an entirely different style of wine also. So you have these more fruit-focused wines, and then we have this very structure-focused wine. So those people that are often very much looking for a big, like Bordeaux or California Cab or that type of thing, that's very tannin based, not barley in my case, but tannin. This actually hits that slot amazingly and interestingly well. So I love it, and I love them all, and I love them all for different reasons, and the fact that they're different is what's great. All right, so last one of this core 5 is the Crooked Run. So this one's a blend. This is putting together from the estate vineyard. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes down here. Petit Verdot at 50%, Tannat at 33%, and Petit Syrah at 17%. You do get a little bit of that like cedary note come in from the Tannat. You do get that tannin coming in from the Petit Syrah. Really interesting wine. It is a dry wine. It has got all these aspects of this structural intensity with the fruity components coming in from down this end. Again, very reminiscent of characteristics of wines in Southwest France. Going to be great aging wine. Definitely this one shifts more towards the intense side as opposed to the elegant side, which is a flip from the year that we had before coming up to this 2020. So hopefully you enjoy all the differences in the vintages, because I actually do. All right, so that's 5. And case production will be listed on your information, and these are all somewhere between 75 and 120 cases, okay? Then we have these other 2 over here. So at release, it's going to be listed, these 5 and then these 2. That might change when this hits the general release and hits the regular menu, because I have different thoughts and approaches to structuring, but I wanted here to present the core 5 and these 2. So these 2 are Trilogy and a zero sulfite Petit Verdot. So they're different because they're different. And the Trilogy is a round 2. So it is a similar wine. It is a different wine than the original Trilogy that came out of 2019. So literally, I put Trilogy V2.0 on the front of the bottle because it's a different version of the same wine. This one is a blend of 2 grapes at the Seven Oaks site. So we have Petit Verdot at 55%, and we have Zweigelt from its first little tiny crop at 17%. And then we have Cabernet Sauvignon from the Arterra Estate Vineyard, 28%, so numbers. And it's interesting because this is like how I approach the Bordeaux concept in Virginia. That Petit Verdot tends to be a better fit than Cabernet Sauvignon in terms of consistency and what it brings to the wines. I have struggled with Cabernet Sauvignon over the years. I think my soils are great for it. I don't think the temperature regime for most of Virginia and most sites in Virginia is appropriate for it. Without going into it, it's very much a cellar craft grape in general. Yes, there are some sites in some places that no matter what can make an amazing Cabernet Sauvignon. I don't know that my site's one of them. It's hard to find a year where it doesn't need something in the cellar, and considering I don't do things in the cellar, blend. So if you love this one, it's 75 cases. It might be the end of the line of this, fairly warned, okay? But it is much more softer of a wine, very medium weight, has more of that classic Cab Sauv Bordeaux-y character. It's not a great big Cab Sauv because, in my understanding, Cab Sauv doesn't usually make big wines without bleed-offs and Saignée and that type of thing in the cellar, and New Oak and all these kind of things. So it is here for you if this is style wine that you love. Awesome. The last one that I have on the end here is a zero sulfite Petit Verdot. So 0 Petit Verdot. It still doesn't say it on the bottom of the bottle. The next vintage will. This was the first time I did it, but it has the cool 0 symbol right at the top to identify it. This is specifically fruit from the Seven Oaks Vineyard, whereas the Petit Verdot down here is the Arterra Estate Vineyard. So right away, it's a different wine. They're different sites, different soils, different clone vine stock selections, all of it. So I wanted to just try this and see, because I try things as a way of learning. So I don't know if experimentation is really the right word as much as exploration. And it's interesting to see the results and impacts and influence of the way that you do things. And other than vessels, oxygen, and temperature, the only other thing I'm working with is sulfite, very low levels, because we don't need much with these tight sealed screw caps that we're using. So it's interesting to see what it does when we make that wine. But there's a whole nother tier to this that comes out over the course of time, is when we take a leap and an exploration and try something different. It gives you a whole different perspective on the why, what, how, like what's going on over here. So it's fascinating how making this wine can help me learn about this wine. So that's part of it. It's reflective. It's making the world bigger so that you can understand what's in the world better. So it helps in all kinds of ways. At least it does for me, and hopefully it's fun for you guys. So what we get here in this wine is typically we have a fresher, fruitier, sometimes floral characteristic comes from the Seven Oaks Vineyard site that is captured in here and embraced and run with. And we have kind of a vivid, little bit lighter, harder, like pleasant, fun drinking Petit Verdot. Great flavor, actually some stature to it from the vintage year, but really pleasant and fresh. So much that when I try it, I imagine having it just cool, maybe not cold, but cool, like through the summertime, really pleasant. One note or point about it is there's all different ways that you can approach unsulfured or unsulfited wines and how to get them to bottle without problems and issues. One common technique is, especially with young bottled and reds that are meant to age, is that they're bottled with that residual subtle spritz of CO2 from the fermentation still in the wine, because they're really not handled at all. That's the case with this one. Is it like a champagne? No. But will you notice that it's there? Yes, you will probably notice that it's there. It is known that it's there, and it's part of this wine. I don't know yet that I do or don't like it, or it's right or wrong, or any of that. Again, we're exploring. And I have one that comes after this that I don't have that spritz in it. And the cheater step there is you put the sparging stone, which micro bubbles nitrogen through the wine, and it blows the CO2 out of the wine. Then you don't have that spritz. So the first time you're going to do anything with no sulfite, or you're going to change anything with no sulfite, you got to be safe. And then once you see what your like buffers and parameters are, then maybe you can do something a little different once you have that comfort zone. But I don't really have anybody to learn these things from, so I'm trying to work with nature, try things, see what happens, see what's next, either keep going down that path or learn that and see how that applies back to the core set of things. So I just hit 33 minutes. If you watched this whole video, you're absolutely amazing, and I cherish you for being a supporter of Arterra Wines. I'm gonna let you go now. I hope to see you sometime soon in the fall. I think this is an outstanding vintage we want to have at Arterra, working with these grapes on good sites with good management. We want to have good years and great years. I think this is definitely in the category of the great years. So thanks to you all. Cheers.